This is a video on child and forced marriages. It is a very big problem in our world today that still goes on, although the idea of it seems very outdated. It is still practiced all over the world. I will have a warning before this that it does talk about rape and sexual assault and very stressful situations. And so, if you've experienced that or you know people who have, I recommend either not watching it or watching it with someone you trust. So, what is a forced marriage? Forced marriages are marriages conducted without the valid consent of both parties, where physical and emotional coercion is a factor. In 2017, the International Labor Organization designated forced marriage as a form of modern slavery. Child marriages are a form of forced marriage where one or both partners are under the age of 18. They often hinder survivors' access to health, education, and opportunity. Many child marriages or forced marriages arranged by parents or family members without considering the consent of the child. Sometimes, when it is called servile marriage, forced marriage also occurs when a wife is forcibly transferred to another in exchange for some type of payment, or when a widow is given no choice and is inherited by one of her husband's male relatives. The key piece into a forced marriage is that at least one of the marrying parties does not give his or her consent. There's no agreed upon international minimum age for marriage consent. However, most countries set the limit at 15 or 18 years old. So, arranged marriages are often mistaken for forced marriages. Some arranged marriages are disguised as forced marriages, but there is a difference between the two. Arranged marriages are an alliance or a contract between two families who take the lead role in selecting a partner for their adult children, who can meaningfully consent to or reject their parents' choices. Historically, these alliances between families serve to safeguard and control property rights, inheritance, and wealth transfers, lineage, etc. So, forced marriage also happens a lot in the U.S. A lot of people don't talk about it, but it happens more often than you think. In the United States, adults and children are forced to marry through familial deception, cultural tradition, emotional blackmail, and threats of abuse or even death. Exceptions allow children under the age of 18 to legally marry. Most states grant children, usually between 16 to 17 years old, a marriage license so long as their parents give parental consent. The other exception involves judicial approval and can allow people under the age of 15 to marry. A site called Unchained at Last found that between 1995 and 2012, judges allowed 178 children between the ages of 10 and 15 to marry in New Jersey. From the sample, a number of children were married to adults. So, how early can you get married in the United States? Of course, it varies by state. Sadly, most states do not have a minimum for marriage, as seen as the states in gray. Some go as low as 12 to 14 years old. But some states, such as New York and Oregon, have the max set at 17. So, as you can see here, forced and child marriages are disproportionately affects women. As seen as this study, 87% of the minors in the U.S. that are married are women, and only 13% are men. And between 2000 and 2015, at least 207,459 minors were married in the United States. An online survey found that the rate of forced marriage in the U.S. was at 11%. Respondents to a national survey reported as many as 3,000 known or suspected cases of forced marriages from 2009 to 2011. Forced marriage was also found in a lot in immigrant communities from 56 different countries, and it's practiced by a number of religions, including Muslims, Christians, Hindus, and Buddhists. So forced marriages globally, around 21% of young women are married before their 18th birthday. And every year, an estimated 14 million girls worldwide under 18 are married without their consent. So where does it happen the most? Forced and early marriages are most common in impoverished states in Africa, South Asia, as well as former Soviet republics. And as you can see in Nigeria, 76% of young women are married before their 18th birthday. In Central African Republic, 68%, and in Chad, 67%. And also, 37% of young women in sub-Saharan Africa are married before the age 18. So in this we find in 2016 there's an estimated 15.4 million people in forced marriages. 88% of these victims were women and girls. 37% of victims were under the age of 18 at the time, and of these 44% were under the age of 15. Specifically in Asia and the Pacific, an estimated 2 persons per 1,000 were victims of forced marriage. As mentioned before, this affects women a lot more than men. Forced marriage is a gender-based violence perpetrated by parents or other family members that can lead to increased vulnerability to abuses, including coerced sexual initiation, marital rape, statutory rape, suppression of sexual orientation or gender identity, interrupted education, domestic violence, and a multitude of others, including early and multiple pregnancies, which often lead in fatalities among young women. So there are several tactics used to entrap, force, or gain consent, or false consent of a minor or adult children. And these include threats or acts of physical harm, imprisonment at the home, threats to marry off a younger sister or a sibling, exile from the parental home, abandonment in the parent's home country, cutting off financial support, or inducing guilt by claiming a parent will commit suicide or die. There are several rationales parents use about arranging what is usually a forced marriage. They pivot around cultural or religious tradition. Historically, early marriage was to protect girls from incest perpetrated by their male relatives in the extended family home. Culture, duty, religion, and honor are typical justifications offered by parents, whereas these are just in fact a proxy for controlling their daughter's sexuality and sexual agency. In many people's views, forced marriage cannot be justified in the name of culture or religion. So I thought it was important to share some of the stories by the brave women who experienced these awful forced marriages. I will also give another warning that a lot of these stories include rape and violence. So I would just be careful if you choose to continue, if you've experienced this before. So I'm going to start with Sharina. Sharina was forced to marry at the age of 14. She says, the story begins with my father. It was my father who suddenly one day took me to an old man who was visiting our village. At the time, I did not know how this old man was the grandfather of the man who would soon become my husband. I also didn't know that meeting this man was to showcase me as a potential bride. After I was chosen as the bride for the old man's grandson, no one talked to me about what was going to happen. At the same time, I dropped out of school. My family traveled to meet the man who would become my husband, but I never met him, not until we were married. At the weddings, where it should be a feast and celebration, I just cried. I sat on a straw mat in front of all the others in my yellow sari, while I was decorated with yellow flowers in my hair and around my neck. Henna tattoos were also drawn on my hands and up my arm. Thoughts flew around my head. Was this really happening now? How could it be? A wedding should be a happy moment, but this was tragic. I knew I was far too young. Nazir, my husband, had also been forced to marry when his mother could no longer manage to care for him. She had shown him my picture and told him that it was now or never. As we drove away from my home, we did not say a word. When I finally glanced at him, I thought that he was not handsome. I didn't like the look of him, and tears came back, and I fainted. In the first few days, we hardly spoke. The tone between us was formal and brief. He eventually asked me to be less formal, but I told him I wanted to go home. He was kind and understanding, but said that I had to realize that this was my life now. And this is Terry. She said, I was raised in a family where abuse and neglect were normal. As a result, I was severely depressed. And at the age of 12, I attempted suicide. I called a local crisis hotline and spoke to a man who was a third-year missionary training student. He convinced me that me and my parents that he could provide counseling to me and that I did not need the antidepressants that the doctors had prescribed. I saw him twice a week for counseling, and from then on. Later that summer, his apartment building caught fire, and he convinced my parents to let him move into our basement. He immediately began molesting me. I became pregnant right before I turned 14. My parents said I could only keep my child if I married him and that I had brought shame to my family. In the May of 1980, we went on a road trip so I could be married off. We first stopped in Kentucky, and when the judge refused to do the ceremony due to my age, we drove to Alabama. There, a judge had no problem with the situation, and in a 6-minute ceremony, I was married to the 28-year-old pedophile who molested me. When my daughter was 2 weeks old, my parents could not stop my husband from beating her, and so I was told we had to move out, as though I could stop him from hurting her. In the next 14 months, I juggled junior high, keeping house, and trying to keep myself and my baby alive around a man who grew more violent every day. I begged my parents for help and told them that he would kill us. Their response was that I was a married woman now and I had to figure it out myself. Eventually, I began counseling again to cure my depression and make me a better wife. My therapist asked me immediately how often my husband beat me, and when I said every day, he promised to help. He had a social worker waiting the next week when I walked into his office. I was taken into shelter for battered children. Eventually, they removed my child from the home as well. Even though most child marriages like mine ultimately end in divorce, those divorces cannot be initiated by the children themselves. I was considered emancipated the day I was married, yet I was too young to drive, get a job, rent an apartment, or file for divorce. I had to have a court-appointed advocate act on my behalf. I left school in the middle of the day to go to court for my divorce. I made it back in time for 11th grade English class. Later, I spent the ages of 18 to 21 drinking every day before I got sober. I've struggled with depression, and perhaps most of all, with having a relationship with my family. It is clear to me now that they traded my safety and that of my daughter to preserve their social standing in the community and in the church. That pain has never completely left me, and my life has never been the same. My relationship with my parents never recovered. I have chronic PTSD and depression. Worse, I had no support system or self-confidence, so I ended up giving my child up for adoption. My coerced marriage was forced on me to cover up sexual abuse for my former husband. It was a way to avoid being charged with a crime. I never felt like a child, only like someone completely incompetent to fix what was happening to us. Even though I know now as a middle-aged woman that I couldn't have done more than I did, it doesn't do much to relieve the nightmares. This didn't happen in a far-off country. I was raised in an upper-middle-class suburban home in the Midwestern United States. My family looked a lot like yours and probably does. And what happened to me is still legal. Children in these marriages are trapped. If there had been laws against marriage before the age of 18, I couldn't have been coerced to marry. I feel strongly that we must outlaw child marriage and that it should not be allowed to be used as a front to hide sexual abuse any longer.